Today, we'll be speaking with Dr. Roy Baumeister on self-regulation and emotion. Dr. Baumeister is currently a professor of psychology at Florida State University. He received his PhD in social psychology from Princeton in 1978 and did a postdoctoral fellowship in sociology at UC Berkeley. Dr. Baumeister's research spans multiple topics, including self and identity, self-regulation, interpersonal rejection and the need to belong, sexuality and gender, aggression, self-esteem, meaning, and self-presentation. He has received research grants from the National Institutes of Health and from the Templeton Foundation. He has authored over 500 publications, and his 31 books include Evil, Inside Human Violence and Cruelty, The Cultural Animal, Meanings of Life, and the New York Times bestseller, Willpower, Rediscovering the Greatest Human Strength. The Institute for Scientific Information lists Dr. Baumeister among the handful of the most cited and influential psychologists in the world. He has received Lifetime Achievement Awards from the Society for Personality and Social Psychology, from the International Society for Self and Identity, and most recently the William James Award from the Association for Psychological Science. So I now turn to our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Roy Baumeister on self-regulation and emotion. So welcome, Roy. Thanks for speaking with us today.
Well, thank you for having me, June.
Great. What I wanted to start out is asking you just a little bit about what, got you first interested in the idea of emotion or studying emotion.
It's hard to say. I mean, I'm interested in everything. My project is I want to understand what human life is all about, and so emotion's a big part of it. I got to it a little bit slower than some of the others. I think some of the specific ideas came from findings that surprised me. I always assumed, as I think most people in our field do, that emotion immediately causes behavior. Mm-hmm. When we review papers or when we submit them and so on, the alternate explanations, and that's how scientists work, is how can we explain this action? It's usually because the person felt this way or had this emotion, or they were afraid, or they were angry, or they were upset, or they were happy, or something. Mm-hmm. So emotion is assumed to be the driving force. And yet several big investigations of mine into other phenomena that just didn't turn out to be true. Mm-hmm. One of the first was self-destructive behavior, something I'm interested in because that's a paradox. And why do people do things that screw themselves up? Yeah. And yet, the assumption, they felt guilty, so they wanted to be punished or something like that. But no, that doesn't appear to be true. Emotion is relevant, but it's not, because of some direct influence of emotional state. And then I work on rejection. There, we assume too that people who are rejected or excluded by others, they'd be upset, and that would drive their behavior. We started doing the studies in the lab. We got huge behavioral effects all the time, and yet we couldn't find any sign of emotion. So obviously emotion was not driving it, and that led me to start questioning how much of a role does emotion play in guiding behavior. So I think that was one of the big things that got me interested in it.
So what I want to ask you then, since you've gotten interested in it, you've done some really interesting studies that shed a lot of important insights on emotion and the nature of self-regulation. So, for example, you're widely known, for your influential work on the role of human self-regulation, in particular for this concept of ego depletion. And I wondered if you could just tell us a bit more about what you see as the central findings or discoveries in this line of work.
The finding there is that after people exert self-control, after they regulate their behavior in one task, if we present them with another, they do worse on that. So it looks like some of their energy or willpower or something is used up in the first act of self-control, so they don't have as much available for the second one. Controlling emotion can be one of those tasks. After, say, you've had a hard day at work, or after you've been making yourself concentrate or controlling your performance to make yourself persevere or whatever, then you might have less oomph, less willpower for controlling your emotions afterwards, and you might react more strongly, or you might let your emotions guide your behavior in some way. And more recent findings are suggesting that one effect of this depleted state is that people actually feel their emotions more intensely. So not only are you not restraining them, although that might somehow feed into it, but the amount you're upset by watching an upsetting movie is higher if your willpower has been depleted in a state of ego depletion. Um,
That's great. I wanted to ask you a little bit more about some of the work that you've done that is more directly relevant to emotion as well. So you've proposed a really interesting theory of emotion as this feedback system, right, that typically has more indirect influences on behavior as opposed to more directly causing, human behavior. And I wondered if you could elaborate on this approach as to how you think emotion shapes behavior.
Okay. I, like everyone else, started out with the assumption that usually emotion is what causes behavior. It's your current emotional state. And that sort of means that the beginnings of behavior are somehow in the emotional state. And that's been criticized by other people who are starting to say there are a lot of behaviors and not that many emotions. There's certainly not as many different emotions. So how you act has to be somehow worked out in the situation. There might be emotions have a sort of broad approach or avoid tendencies, because those are basic, and then you figure out how to apply that in the immediate situation. But to say that anger contains the beginning of aggression in it, and guilt contains whatever, there are all sorts of behaviors people do because they feel guilty. That's questionable. The most common example, and the one everybody uses, and I think that fooled us, is that fear makes you run away. But increasingly people are saying that fear is not a good model for other emotions. A lot of researchers say that, well, in nature, there isn't time for the animal to get afraid. It has to take off immediately as soon as there's the threatening stimulus. If you wait for an emotional state to build up, and then for the brain to say, okay, I'm afraid, that's it, so I better get moving, by then the predator will have eaten you. So the flight happens before the fear. And looking at this, and we reviewed a massive amount of information suggesting that, yes, indeed, emotion is not usually a cause of behavior, and even when it is, it's not that adaptive a behavior. When people act because of their emotional states, they tend to do things that they're sorry about. It's like the familiar example, don't send an email message when you're still mad. Wait till you calm down.
Definitely don't,
before you hit send. You can write it, but don't hit send. And that's, it interferes with your judgment. So what that means is that that's not why we evolved emotions, is to guide our behavior if it makes us do things that are often stupid and self-destructive. Still, people without emotions don't behave very effectively. There's something useful there, so there has to be some other process. And that made us think it's what emotion does is make you reflect on the experience after the fact, so that you learn the lesson and that you extract how to behave in the future. That turns out to be highly adaptive and is pretty common. It hasn't been studied nearly as much, but we think maybe the next couple decades emotion researchers should stop looking so much at current emotional states and start looking at anticipated emotional states. Guilt is a great example in that. It's a much better example than fear, perhaps, as a prototype for how emotion works in general. You do something, it turns out to be bad, and you feel guilty. I mean, most people don't deliberately do things that are going to make them feel guilty. They do something, and then they say, oh, you hurt me, or you made me feel bad, I had this. And then you feel guilty and you feel bad. Guilt makes you reflect on what you did. And I shouldn't have done this, or if I had done this, it would have worked out better. And so then it stores a little trace, a little like emotional tag, so that the next time you're in that situation, you're tempted to do the same thing, and you have this little memory, this little tag, which has an automatic cute bit of affect attached to it, and says, oh, that's danger, and that reminds you the last time you did that, you got in trouble and you felt bad, so you avoided it. Guilt can really be a powerful and effective guide of behavior if you almost never feel guilty. As long as you avoid doing things that will make you feel guilty, then you can stay out of trouble. And that's really the ideal. That's what we strive for in civilized life, is not to to feel guilty all the time for the bad things we do, but rather to learn to avoid doing things that will make us feel guilty. And if everybody did that, the world would be a better place.
So it's interesting because you've talked about the role of anticipation and reflection in your model, and I wonder if you could just elaborate a tiny bit more. I know you've alluded to this on the role of feedback, right, in the way emotion shapes behavior.
Yes. Remember, emotion, we're talking here about the full-fledged conscious emotion that takes a little while to arise. In the heat of the moment, in the crisis or whatever, that might get in the way. But there seems to be a delayed reaction that afterwards you feel bad or you feel good about something that pulls your mind to back and to reflect on what you did so that you can extract the lesson. It's especially important for humans because our social lives are so complicated. There's so many things going on that we can reflect on what we did badly and learn all the different ways that we might avoid it. I mean, you go into a store to buy something and something goes wrong and you buy it badly and you feel bad afterwards. Well, you can't never buy anything again. You can't avoid, wearing clothes or whatever. So you figure out how, in that situation, could I have avoided the problem or the bad outcome? It takes really some scrutiny over, ruminating, mulling it over. And emotion seems to be really good at that. We know emotion stimulates you to replay events, not just how they happened, but in what's called counterfactual ways. You replay the event with different actions and different outcomes. And finally you settle on one, well, this then would have produced a good outcome. This is maybe what I should have done. And then you store that away, and the next time a similar situation arises, there's a little a tag and a little bit of the automatic affective feeling, and brings back, yes, I learned my lesson the last time, and you behave better. So it's again, it's not that the current emotional state is teaching you how to act in the present, but it's helping you learn the lesson from what happened so that the next time you can do better. And as I said, as you learn to anticipate the emotions, that really facilitates the process too. As with guilt, if you learn, if I do this again, I'll end up feeling guilty again, so I'm not going to do this.
Great. So thank you for sharing your insights on this really important work in terms of how emotion shapes behavior and also kind of the role of self-regulation. I wondered if you could say a little bit, as you're thinking forward, where you see the future of the field headed in this domain.
All right. Well, sorry for the pause. When in our theory about emotion is feedback, there's the currently felt emotion, your current state, and that's what researchers study a lot of. And then there's the anticipation of how you could feel in the future. Now, when we looked at which of those are driving behavior, we found that current emotional state, and we took this, we looked in our top journal, the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, every article since 1987 when they started doing mediation analyses. And we found several hundred articles that tested for mediation by emotion. And the vast majority were not significant. Emotion, your currently felt emotional state, was not driving your behavior. We also looked at ones on anticipated emotion. And there were only about a dozen, but 90% of those guided behavior. So it looks like if we want to understand how people act, looking at anticipated emotion is the way to go, but nobody's doing that yet. So I think the field is likely to wake up sometime in the next 10 years, maybe with some of us encouraging them, to say that trying to understand behavior based on what's driving it in your current emotional state, that's not getting us as far. But looking at anticipated emotion, we haven't looked at that, and that's where all the action is. That really deserves a lot more intensive study. I think we need to sharpen up our terms and our concepts and our understanding. The term emotion is used in lots of different ways. We had to distinguish sort of those little tags of you get a little twinge of this is good or this is bad. That counts as emotion to some people, but it's very different from walking around weeping and sobbing with remorse or grief or something because something really bad just happened. So separating those states, I think those are important. And understanding how they fit together, how emotion fits in the big picture, I think that's still a challenge. There's emotion, cognition, motivation. Those seem to be the three big categories, with behavior being the output. And so exactly how does emotion fit in there and contribute to occasionally messing us up, but more often than not helping us live the good life? I think that's the way to go.
Thank you. And my last question for you is, what advice do you have for students who are thinking about embarking in this field? What might you tell them?
To study emotion, I think the most pressing need is for methodological creativity. If you can think of ways to study emotional states, to get people in them, that's what's held it back. We know a lot more about cognition than about emotion, and I think that's not because cognition is more important or more prevalent. It's just that it's easier to study. So always be on the lookout for new methods. That, I think, historically has held back the study of emotion. So come up with new methods, and then be really disciplined and critical and looking at the ideas. There are a lot of theories, and try to understand what's right about everyone and what's wrong about it.
Great. Well, thank you so much for speaking today.
Well, thank you for having me on.
So this concludes our Experts in Emotion interview with Dr. Roy Baumeister from Florida State University. Thank you so much again.